There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending your whole life translating yourself, not language, something deeper than that. The way you carry yourself differently depending on which room you're in, the things you emphasize and the things you leave out. The version of you that belongs here, and the version that belongs there, and the constant quiet work of managing the distance between them. Zinedine Zidane grew up doing that work before he was old enough to name it. His parents had left the Kabylie region of Algeria and built a life in La Castellane, one of Marseille's most difficult neighborhoods. At home, there was Arabic, there was couscous, there were stories about mountains his parents had left behind. Outside, there was France, a country that had given his family refuge, but hadn't quite decided what to do with them yet. On the football pitch, the translation problem temporarily disappeared. The ball didn't ask where you were from. The space between defenders opened the same way regardless of your name. And so Zidane poured himself into that space, building something in those concrete courtyards that was entirely and unmistakably his own, belonging to no country, only to him. What he couldn't know, practicing alone against a wall in Marseille, was that one day those two worlds would need him to stand between them. And that for one night in Paris, he would be the only person in France capable of doing it. By 1998, France was a country that had been arguing with itself for decades about what it was. The official story, liberté, égalité, fraternité, was beautiful and genuinely believed by many. But 5 million French citizens of North African descent experienced a different version of the country. The job interview that never called back, the apartment that was suddenly unavailable, the neighborhood where the police arrived differently than elsewhere. This wasn't a hidden secret. Everyone knew it. What made it painful was the gap between the ideal France believed in and the reality many of its citizens lived. The country was geographically unified and spiritually unresolved, a mirror with a crack running through it that no one quite knew how to repair. When the national football team qualified for the 1998 World Cup as hosts, something interesting happened. The squad that Aimé Jacquet assembled was a portrait of the France that actually existed. Players with roots in Senegal, Guadeloupe, Algeria, Ghana, Argentina, Armenia. The team was nicknamed Black, Blanc, Bleu. Black, white, Arab, and some people celebrated this as proof that France worked. Others viewed it with suspicion. The argument about what the team represented was really the argument France had been having with itself for years. And at the center of it all, by talent and by biography, was a boy from La Castellane whose parents had crossed the Mediterranean with almost nothing. Zidane had been playing for the national team since 1994 and had already become one of the best players in the world at Juventus. But the question that followed him wasn't about his ability. It was about his belonging. Some corners of French opinion couldn't quite reconcile the Algerian name, the immigrant neighborhood, the Arabic spoken at home with the idea of a French hero. The question, rarely asked directly but always present, was, is he really one of us? Zidane never answered it with words. He was famously private, uncomfortable with interviews, allergic to the kind of statement-making that the question seemed to demand. His mother Malika once said he had learned from childhood to carry both worlds inside him, that he'd never had the luxury of choosing one identity, so he had learned to be both or be nothing. But that kind of complexity doesn't fit easily into a newspaper headline or a political argument. What he could do, what he had always been able to do, was answer with his body, with his feet, with the specific way he occupied space on a football pitch, finding solutions that nobody else had seen, creating moments that existed briefly and then became permanent. He had been answering that question his entire career. Most of France just hadn't been paying attention yet. On July 12, 1998, 30 million people were finally watching. The Stade de France held 80,000 people that night, and the air had the particular quality of a country holding its breath. Brazil were the defending champions, the favorites, carrying Ronaldo, who had himself gone through something strange and unexplained that afternoon, a kind of collapse that his teammates would describe for years without quite agreeing on what it was. France had never won a World Cup. The weight of it was visible on the players. 27 minutes in, Emmanuel Petit swung a corner from the left. The ball curved toward the near post, and Zidane arrived at it. Not sprinting, not leaping dramatically, but simply being in the right place with his head in the right position, and directed it into the net with the kind of precision that looks inevitable only in retrospect. What happened next, simultaneously across France, was this. In the expensive seats, and in the housing estates, in the city centers, and in the banlieues, in living rooms where French had been spoken for generations, and in apartments where Arabic was still the language of private life. The same sound. The same release. Arab families in Marseille housing projects celebrated alongside traditionally French supporters. For that moment, everyone was crying for the same reason. For the first time, one woman from an Algerian immigrant family remembered. We were finally on the same side of something beautiful. 18 minutes later, he did it again. Yuri Djurkev's corner. Zidane's head. The net. 2-0. If the first goal had been relief, the second was something else. Excess in the best sense. The kind of beautiful surplus that turns sporting achievement into something that outlasts the moment. France didn't need the second goal to win. Zidane scored it anyway. There's a detail that matters here. Both goals came from headers. Zidane was not primarily a header of the ball. His genius lived in his feet, in the close control, and the disguised pass and the half-turn that created space from nothing. Heading was something other players did. And yet on the most important night of his career, in front of the largest audience he would ever play before, the goals came from his head. It felt like a statement, even if he never framed it that way. The part of him that thought, that chose, that decided, that was what won France the World Cup. Not just the physical gift, but the mind behind it. The mind shaped by two languages, two cultures, two versions of what it meant to belong somewhere. Emmanuel Petit added a third in injury time. The final score was 3-0. France had won the World Cup for the first time, and the country that emerged from that match was, for at least one night, different from the country that had entered it. The scenes on the Champs-Élysées that night were unlike anything the street had witnessed since the liberation. 1 million people, maybe more. Algerian flags flew alongside French tricolors without controversy. People embraced strangers. The identity argument that had run through French political life for a generation fell momentarily silent, not because it had been resolved, but because something had happened that made it feel, briefly, beside the point. Zidane's image was projected onto the Arc de Triomphe, an Algerian immigrant's son, his face filling the arch that Napoleon had built to celebrate French military glory. The symbolism was almost too obvious to be real. France had won its World Cup, and the face of that victory was a man whose parents had crossed the Mediterranean with almost nothing, who had grown up in one of the country's most marginalized neighborhoods, who had spent his whole life translating between two worlds that weren't sure they wanted to be reconciled. The political scientist Christophe Bertossi said afterward that, for one night, France had become the country it always claimed to be. That's the more honest version of what happened. The euphoria was real. But it was also a glimpse, a brief moment when the gap between the ideal and the reality closed enough that people could feel what it might be like if it stayed that way. It didn't stay that way. The cracks came back. They always do. But the night happened, and it couldn't be taken back. 7 years later, in 2005, France burned. The banlieues, the neighborhoods like the one Zidane had grown up in, erupted in weeks of riots after two teenagers fleeing a police check were electrocuted in a power substation. The underlying causes were everything the 1998 celebration had briefly obscured: unemployment, discrimination, the permanent feeling of being French in name only. And then in 2006, in Berlin, Zidane headbutted Marco Materazzi in the chest during the World Cup final and was sent off in the last match of his career. Materazzi had said something about his family. The exact words are known now, have been known for years. Something about his sister. Something designed to reach through the football and find the man underneath. Zidane turned and acted, and in 10 seconds undid the careful control of a lifetime. Some people interpreted the headbutt as proof that the bridge of 1998 had always been fragile, that the unity was performance rather than substance. But that reading misses something. Zidane's composure had never been the point. His perfection had never been the foundation of what he represented. What he represented was more complicated and more durable than that. A person who had lived between worlds, who had built something remarkable out of that position, and who was also capable of rage and loss of control like anyone else. The bridge, if it existed, was not built from marble. It was built from something more ordinary, and therefore more honest. The actual texture of a life lived in two languages, in two cultures, with two sets of expectations pressing from either side. What July 12, 1998 actually did was simpler and more lasting than any political argument about it. It gave a generation of young people in France, specifically young people whose parents or grandparents had come from somewhere else, a piece of evidence. Not an argument, not a speech, not a law. Evidence that the journey from La Castellane to the Arc de Triomphe was possible. That the translation work, the exhausting daily effort of belonging to two things at once, could produce something rather than just cost something. Zidane never claimed to be a symbol. He was always uncomfortable with that role, always retreating from the interpretations that others placed on his career. In interviews, he talked about his parents, about Marseille, about the game itself. He didn't offer himself as proof of anything. But the two headers happened. And the image on the Arc de Triomphe happened. And across France, in neighborhoods that rarely got to see themselves reflected in the country's celebrations, something shifted. Not completely, not permanently, but measurably. Young people who had been told in various ways that they were not quite French enough watched a man whose story began like theirs win the World Cup for France. That doesn't solve anything, but it changes what feels possible. Zidane once said that the bridge isn't finished, that every generation has to add their own stones. He said it quietly, the way he said most things, without apparent awareness of the weight of it. But he was right. What happened in 1998 was a foundation, not a completion. The work is still going on, in ways that have nothing to do with football, carried by people who may not even know they're building something that a man from La Castellane started July night in Paris.